Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel on operational collaboration enhancing cyber readiness. My name is Greg Rattray. The panel is going to focus on the recent work that myself and the other panelists have done as part of the New York Cyber Task Force, where I had the honor to be the executive director. I'm also a senior adjunct professor at Columbia University, where there was real sponsors of the task force work, and am the founder and partner at NextPeak Consulting. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves. So Erica, over to you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Erica Borgard. I'm a senior director on the Cyberspace Valerium Commission. Michael, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Erica. I'm Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is a group of cybersecurity companies that share threat intelligence with each other. Christopher?
Thanks, Michael. I'm Chris Button. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer of the Analysis and Resilience Center, the ARC. We analyze and develop resiliency measures for systemic risk in the financial services sector and the energy sector, and work with the government to identify solutions and warn against threats. Back to you, Greg.
Thanks, Chris. Very quickly, we're going to go through an initial presentation that really talks to, the topic here, and particularly the work of the recent New York Cyber Task Force. And then we'll turn it to perspectives from the people you just met, as in terms of the panelists, and a little dialogue between the four of us. So what do we mean by operational collaboration? It's actually a word that has come more into usage in the cybersecurity community. As Erica might mention, the Valerium Commission report itself actually used the concept. In my mind, it's the public-private partnerships to enable coordinated cyber defense actions. Again, Michael will probably speak specifically to the types of actions we're talking to, but additionally to do the proactive work in joint planning and capacity building for cyber resilience, which is one of the principal purposes of the Analysis and Resilience Center, and Chris will probably talk to those concepts as well. It really sort of, some of the bottom line up front from the task force's work is, as we considered, how to move forward and, use this concept in light of the current state of public-private partnerships in the United States for cybersecurity, we definitely identified challenges. I'll go through sort of how we thought through the problem here in a moment, but to really baseline on our findings, we have not really identified national security level contingencies that drive, how we think about, both in the public and the private sectors, being able to respond to these contingencies and have the capacities and the investment necessary to do so. One of the reasons I think we believe that this has occurred is we still are absent a focal point for coordinating the national security level cyber readiness efforts in the country. We do look to the recommendations that were of the commission that were instantiated in the National Defense Authorization Act, and are hopeful that a national cyber director within the federal government will play a role, but remind everyone that it's much more than a federal government challenge in terms of once we build a system, and we'll talk to what that system looks like. And then, I think at the core, as we discuss these issues, that both the technology industry and critical infrastructure in the private sector need to be real national security partners and work shoulder to shoulder with the government. If we look a bit at how the task force did its work, I think one of the things, and I hope you will have an opportunity to take a look at the task force report, but we focused very much on looking forward into the future and not sort of current organizational constructs in the government, building upon a lot of the work that has existed, to build public-private partnerships. But we wanted to make sure we were working at the high level, at the level of what our national security risk drivers, and we identified a set of national security drivers for risks. And then we formed those into scenarios, which I'll touch upon here in a moment. But I think we think one of the most valuable elements of our work is actually taking that thought pattern forward into the future and actually raising sort of our consideration of what it means to be ready to not just things we've already seen, but to the more severe but plausible things that might occur. And we derived a set of scenarios from that. I'll show those here in a moment, but if you have the chance to look at those scenarios, I think the experts on the task force thought that they were very much a good representative suite of the things that could challenge us. And then we use a methodology that's sometimes referred to as a day after methodology that was pioneered by the RAND Corporation to take ourselves into crisis situations that might occur 5 years from now based on these scenarios. Think about what we would not have been ready with, and then come back to recommendations that of things we could do now, which I'll outline here in a moment. So not to sort of repeat the specifics on the slide, but to understand challenges, we do think the work is innovative in the sense that we really started with what are the things that could cause us severe risks in the evolving cyber environment. And we came up with the drivers that you see here on the slide. And to note, some of those are traditional cybersecurity technical concerns, the technical ecosystem itself, but also, the nature of geopolitics. All these things are a mix of the types of concerns that we tried to pick an illustrative set of 4 scenarios. So again, they're available in the report. You see them here in the slides. I think one of the more innovative things that we did was to talk about in scenario 4, the notion that the domestic extremist groups could cause substantially disruptive risks. It was interesting, we made that decision back in the summer of 2020. And I think we're all, continue to be concerned that, our domestic groups could cause risk, and cyberspace might be one of those places. So if you get the opportunity, you might be interested in looking at that. In terms of recommendations, and I've got a couple more slides that really explain an element of this. I'm going to focus here on that. One of the things that we felt like is essential is it's hard to plan for national security if you don't start with a prioritized list of situations you need to get ready. In both military planning, but also in emergency management planning, you drive a lot of your understanding of what you need to do, who needs to be involved, and how much to invest by identifying contingencies. So we really think that's an urgent challenge. I'm going to talk to the nature of what we recommended in terms of a national cyber response network and how to get that network capable and ready here in the next couple slides. So this is a complicated diagram, but it's complicated on purpose. It's actually meant to be just really an illustration to show a couple things. First, that it's a system of nodes working together. It's not a top-down, directed, set of actions. The different nodes in the system that we envision need to be coordinated, and there needs to be some common approach to how they conduct their operations, common information flows, and situational awareness. We also wanted to stress that it certainly involves nodes that are governmental and not just in the federal government, but also in the private sector, both the operators of technology and infrastructures, groups that they formed. And I think we also want to stress the notion that we don't see these nodes are very much building on a lot of the work and organizations that have taken place. We're not calling for a new system with a new set of nodes. It's really a new way to operate our capabilities, assess whether they can actually meet the challenges we've identified in the scenarios. So if I take a quick look, what we hope for is that if we understand the contingencies, will increasingly know which nodes would be responsible for conducting what sorts of projected operations or responses in those contingencies, that you would have a basis for assessing whether they were capable for a given contingency, if they were activated of performing the things that we think that would be necessary. And then the sort of last major recommendation, that we fundamentally believe training and exercising and working together proactively before we have a crisis will make us much more capable in the case of a specific scenario. I'm not going to go into the next 5 sort of recommendations that we made, which really are about enabling. Just a couple thoughts, which was one, we distinguished between the sort of recommendations that were about sort of instantiating contingencies and the new network. We think in terms of enabling, these are things that would need to occur to make that network function at a higher level, many of which have been discussed in other sorts of reports and analyses, including the Solarium Commission, everything, that's listed here on the slide. So again, encourage people to dig in. I guess the one, again, maybe to point to where I think we added a new set of thinking, is the notion of building trust and confidence. One of the things we found over and over again in our work is a limitation that has really crept increasingly into the system, is the fact that the different nodes need to understand and have confidence in each other. So we explicitly called out the types of things that would be necessary for trust between the private sector and the government, and between nodes in the system. So with that, I think I've reached the end of my time, at least to get us started. And Erica, I would turn it over to you for your thoughts.
Great, thanks so much, Greg. So, from my perspective, an important contribution of the New York Cyber Task Force was to stress test some of the recommendations from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission about operational collaboration through the different scenarios that Greg just spoke to, and also to sort of explore how we could extend the Commission's recommendations to address in more detail how they might be implemented. To give you some brief background on the Commission, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission is a congressional commission. It was established in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, and its purpose was to develop a strategy and a set of policy recommendations to defend the nation in cyberspace against cyber attacks of significant consequences. And a core part of the Commission's ultimate recommendations was grounded in improving how the government can work together with the private sector to defend the nation in cyberspace. The Commission put forth a number of different recommendations that were aimed at achieving that. Some of them, like the Senate-confirmed National Cyber Director, were subsequently created into law in the 2021 NDAA. Others, the Commission is continuing to sort of elaborate on and work toward. And I would say overall, the take-home point in terms of the New York Cyber Task Force is that our task force strongly validated the Solarium Commission's emphasis on operational collaboration between the government and the private sector. So moving beyond existing information sharing models to more meaningful and institutionalized and ongoing collaboration. And I just thought I would highlight 3 Solarium Commission recommendations that I saw as being sort of a common thread throughout the different scenarios that the New York Cyber Task Force workshopped, and then that kind of helped inform the task force's ultimate recommendations. The first is creating a joint cyber planning office within CISA, which was established in law in this past NDAA cycle. And the point of the joint cyber planning office was to facilitate this comprehensive planning of defensive cybersecurity campaigns that would include both federal government and private sector stakeholders. The second Solarium recommendation that played heavily in the New York Cyber Task Force's scenarios was the idea of this integrated cyber center, also within CISA, to support critical infrastructure security and resilience. And this is another recommendation that was incorporated into the 2021 NDAA. And then finally, the commission recommended creating a joint collaborative environment, which did not make it into this past NDAA cycle. We'll see what happens in the next NDAA cycle. But the joint collaborative environment was meant to be sort of a central hub for fusing information from the government and from the private sector at classified and unclassified levels about cyber threats, malware forensics, data from network monitoring programs, and so on, to enable getting at that more comprehensive picture of the threat environment and that shared situational awareness. And the joint collaborative environment was meant to feed into and support the efforts of the Joint Cyber Planning Office and the Integrated Cyber Center. So as we workshopped the 4 different scenarios in the New York Cyber Task Force and stress tested some of these commission recommendations, I think the New York Cyber Task Force's report presents a vision of what the commission's recommendations on operational collaboration might look like in practice. And to me, there's sort of 2 points that stand out in terms of how the New York Cyber Task Force pushed the ball forward in terms of the Solarium Commission's recommendations on operational collaboration. The first, and Greg mentioned this in his discussion, is this idea of institutionalizing collaboration on a routine basis before a crisis takes place. Stakeholders need to learn how to work together and to iterate working together before a crisis happens. And this requires a lot of things. It requires establishing shoulder-to-shoulder joint training and routinely exercising playbooks that are developed with stakeholders from the government and the private sector before crises occur, so that if and when they do happen, response teams don't have to waste valuable time trying to figure out how to actually work together. And I also think what's interesting is there should be a learning element to these exercises so that gaps that are identified through them can then be remediated and addressed in advance. The second important point from my perspective has to do with real collaborative analysis. It's important to have rapid and synchronous threat and information sharing, but that alone is insufficient. What you also need is this sort of vision of co-located analysis where the government and private sector analysts are able to sit side by side and work together on shared threats. And this would also help improve strategic warning. So being able to not just respond to malicious behavior after it's already occurred, but ideally to anticipate impending adversary activity and get left of boom. And so for this to happen, the private sector has to be involved in helping to define what indicators and warnings are of adversary activity, not only because they see so much, the private sector sees so much of how threat actors are operating on their own networks, but also because they have unique and industry-specific knowledge and expertise that can help identify what those indicators should be. So overall, I'm hopeful that the New York Cyber Task Force's work can help inform ongoing efforts at improving operational collaboration that are happening right now and being implemented across the federal government. And I look forward to seeing how our work plays out over the next year. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Erica. So I want to talk a little bit today about how we actually make operational collaboration work in practice. And so that term, Greg has mentioned it, Erica's been talking about it. So what do we actually mean? To me, operational collaboration means not just sharing information, but actually taking operational activities, actions, and synchronizing them in time and intent so that you can better achieve strategic objectives of either disrupting what the bad guys are doing, as Erica was talking about, left of boom, or if we find ourselves after an event has happened and needing to respond to it and to stop an ongoing event, for example, that we can do that more effectively. And given the capabilities that reside in the private sector, the ownership of the assets, literally the IT infrastructure of most of the planet is owned by the private sector. So how do you need the private sector and the government actually working together to make those effects happen and to happen at the scale that we want them to happen. Now, we've been struggling with information sharing for 20, 25 years. So if we think information sharing is hard, operational collaboration is even harder. Now, it happens, and it happens frequently, as a matter of fact. There are ad hoc groups that come together that take action together. We've seen it. We saw it just this past fall with Emotet and a very effective takedown operation that happened against them. The challenge is that those operations do not happen at the scope and the scale and the cadence that we need. And particularly when you start looking at the scenarios that the New York Cyber Task Force was dealing with, these very high-end cyber events that are highly disruptive across much of the infrastructure, it's unlikely that sort of these ad hoc informal groups will be sufficient all on their own. And so how do we actually make that happen? How do we scale up? How do we broaden the scope? How do we increase the cadence of what we're trying to achieve? And that is what the New York Cyber Task Force's recommendations really focused on. And a major piece of that was that National Cyber Readiness Network that Greg was referring to. And what that really is it's actually taking the internet, the structure of the internet itself, and making it work for the good guys as opposed to just against the bad guys, as opposed to just for the bad guys, which is that the internet itself is a network of networks. It is a series of nodes that are highly connected together. So we want to do that in a readiness network and make those connections firmer, make those connections more real, if you will. And so you can think of it as really a node and cell concept. So the nodes would be permanent organizations out in the private sector, some in the government, but the ones in the private sector would really serve a couple of purposes. One, they would help build that long-term relationship, those legal agreements that the government has to have in place in order for it to function well. It would be those places could be the repositories for the lessons that have been learned on previous operations to improve future operations. They could be the enablers of the infrastructure, so you don't have to rebuild it every time you want to go and do a new collaboration. In essence, you can sort of think of them as the co-work spaces for operational collaboration. The action is actually carried out by what you can think of as threat cells or action groups, working groups, whatever you want to call them. But these are more informal elements that come together as needed to deal with a particular threat, with the relevant players from both the public and the private sector. They can come together underneath one of these cells, in essence, and sort of fall in on the infrastructure that's already there. And so that builds on Greg's point, builds on Erica's point about that way you're not rebuilding everything every single time you're trying to do a collaboration. And in this way, we think that you can dramatically scale up, broaden the scope, and increase that cadence of operations so that we can start to have a meaningful impact on the adversaries, both proactively, left of boom, and to really shrink down and reduce the impact of anything that does go wrong so that we can also respond and recover much more quickly from those kinds of events. Now, obviously, the private sector operates in very different ways from the government. And these informal ad hoc groups that exist outside of any sort of formal arrangements, of course, they are going to continue to exist. And they will continue to, get together and do stuff. And this is not meant to say that those things should stop. But we want to provide a structure that bridges some of those gaps between the private sector and the public sector in a way that will actually improve the cybersecurity of the entire ecosystem. So I just want to close by saying I'm really proud of the work that the New York Cyber Task Force did. I think that looking at challenging scenarios that push the envelope, but are still realistic, that could actually happen, and force us to really think about where the shortfalls and the gaps are, was really, really important. And as Greg said, I highly recommend taking a look at that report because I think it did a lot of really good work and built upon the work of the Slayham Commission quite effectively. But now I'm going to turn it over to Christopher so he could talk a little bit about his experience actually making operational collaboration work from the perspective of the financial sector.
Thank you, Michael. And I'll just piggyback on Michael's compliments on the task force's work, Greg. And thank you, Erica. I think you covered, what operational collaboration looks like, in a pretty detailed way. Let me tell you what my organization does, because I think sometimes, there's this, when we're talking about operational collaboration, I'm reminded of my early days, or the early days of the Department of Homeland Security when, when I first heard the term information sharing, and this is in the context of reviewing like a 200-page document describing an information sharing environment. And I didn't get it. That was my initial reaction. The concept of info sharing, I got, right? Communicate things known here that will help better defend against X, Y, or Z there, and vice versa. But the thing I didn't get was, why do we need 200 pages worth on this? But as I got acquainted, it turns out my initial impression was right. I didn't get it, and that doing that simple thing requires breaking down a lot of institutional barriers, thinking through real authorities issues. There's technology issues, there's geography issues, there's resource. There's all these things that need to happen in order to make a muscle movement like that happen. And I bring that up because, first, information sharing went from concept to professional discipline with pretty well understood norms over however long the development was, but certainly since the first time I became acquainted, to where it is today, right? It's a well understood thing. And but my initial reaction to that is, I think you also get that a lot when you start talking about operational collaboration, right? Well, yeah, great idea. We should work together, right? Aren't we doing that? And to both Michael and Erica's points, we are in some ways, but be careful with that instinct to say we're already doing it, right? Because all of the authorities, resourcing, issues, all the issues I just described for standing up an information sharing environment exists in order to connect those bubbles that were on Greg's, the slide that Greg showed, and operationalize those. So our role, I want to be this too was lesson learned in the past, right? Be specific about what you're doing and what you need, and don't pretend that meeting this much of a requirement is the whole thing, right? Because that too interferes with progress. Michael's organization has a really distinct role in the ecosystem. Mine is this: our organization, the ARC, so we're founded on a pretty simple concept that there are critical functions, DHS has defined them, and those functions are supported by critical assets, and some of those assets reside in the private sector, and regardless of the fact that in the private sector, a successful cyber attack on those could have a national security level impact. What we do is try to understand at a very deep level what those assets are, and then work to both take some upfront resiliency measures and build in some sort of intelligence capabilities so that we can identify threats to those systems. It's reduce the impact and the likelihood of an event that Michael spoke to earlier. Doing that requires requires a collaborative effort that sounds a lot like the operational collaboration that we're all describing here, right? We work closely across members, across the financial sector, the energy sector. We work with double-digit, numbers of government agencies. We work with the ISACs. We work with, trade organizations. I'm sure I'm forgetting someone, but the point behind the effort is that understanding those risks and doing something about them at a deep level requires something more than the regular meetings, and it's more than what we're doing now. But I will say this, that in Michael's introduction, an example of a place where we're doing operational collaboration, the ARC is finding its way with a multitude of government partners and private sector firms and all the whole ecosystem I just mentioned in a way that is solving a lot of those problems that we talked about. Is it the shoulder to shoulder collaboration, which shoulder to shoulder in 2020 is not the greatest way of thinking about it, but in long term it is. But is it the shoulder to shoulder kind of collaboration that we're talking about? In some places it is. In some places it's less than that. But I think the ecosystem is moving in the right direction. We're solving a lot of these problems. And so I know we're getting short on time. So Greg, I believe this is where I turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yep, and I think we've got some time for questions. I think I'd like to pose the first one really to the others, and maybe just I'll lead in with a thought. But now we've laid out a pretty expansive set of things that to think about and can be done. I'd ask everybody what the specific next step is, and also to lean in with my belief that the first step is to actually establish some national cyber contingencies that we would plan towards, right? That we need to move beyond reacting to the events of the day and really establish what those national cyber contingencies are and have a system for that. But with that, I'd ask each of you to sort of, if you were to have one thing that you would have be the focus of these efforts in this upcoming year, what would that be? Erica, I guess I'll start with you, and then that sort of the same batting order that we used previously.
Sure. So I guess, from my perspective, especially coming from the Solarium Commission, I would say on the government side, I think the clear next step is for the president to nominate and the Senate to confirm a national cyber director. As well as to figure out how the office, the overall office of the National Cyber Director should be structured, how it should be staffed, how it will interact with the private sector, how to define roles and responsibilities in relation to other stakeholders in the government, especially the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Tech and with CISA. And so I think that the NCD exists. And so figuring out, how to, create it is the next clear step.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, and I think, Greg, that, in addition to actually standing up the office of the National Cyber Director, I agree with you that picking a few and starting contingencies and starting to plan towards them, they will inevitably not be the right ones in the sense of that contingency probably won't actually happen. But it's the process of planning for a contingency that will enable you to deal with whatever it is that actually does occur. It's kind of like the old saying that of Eisenhower's, the plan is nothing, planning is everything. So it's actually that's the value of those national cyber contingencies. The other piece that I would say is we just need to try. Like we need to actually try some operational collaboration efforts at a broader scale. And see where we go wrong, right? Where does it fall down? Where does it, trip over itself? And build on those lessons learned, and so that we can do better the next time. So I would say I think it's going to be very important for the government and the private sector to just start exercising some of this. We can analyze it to death, and the government is very, very good at doing that. And we just need to try.
I appreciate it. And, I'm going to turn to you, Chris. And, my belief is the FSARC and now the ARC is one place that we've been trying. So as a person at the front line of operational collaboration, what do you think the sort of key thing you'd focus on this year would be?
I agree with that. I think there's two parts of the question, right? The corporate side and the government side. I think on the private sector, the corporate leadership side, that standing up organizations like mine, like Michael's, where the private sector is coming together in that node that the government can interface with in a scalable way around these national security level cyber readiness problems. I think there's a very much an element of like, let's make that work in the way Michael's describing. On the government side, I think that not to, say, I don't want to say keep doing what we're doing, but there are models that exist already for how operational collaboration can work, right? We've proved that we can work together in ways that are, if not exactly as described in the Cyber Task Force, that are approaching it. And that it is the repetition and the exercising of that muscle movement and the expansion of it, I think, like, recognize that national security treatment and then keep building on that concept.
Thanks. We just have a couple minutes left. So I'm going to, Michael, you had raised a point for us as we were discussing the panel. I'll sort of lay that out, and I'm going to actually go to you to answer the question, which is, you and I, actually everybody in this panel has worked together to some degree. This sort of notion that, the governments need formal structures and authorities to get things done, to even feel authorized to act, but the private sector is often, much less structured and actually can feel like if that's enforced upon them, you resist collaboration. How do we square those two circles?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the most challenging parts of the area, because, as you said, Greg, like, for the government, for very good reason, right? Because we're a nation of laws and we believe in limited government. So we don't want the government to just have free reign to go do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, right? We want it to have structure and process and constraints, right? We want those things on the government. But a lot of times that's an anathema to the private sector. And so if you start talking about MOUs and legal agreements, and their head starts to explode and then they just walk away. And so what we really have to think about doing is creating, and that's why I think these nodes that could exist in the private sector, that are nonprofits, for example, things like the ARC, things like CTA, there are other organizations that could do that can serve as that bridging function, that allow that informality to happen on the private sector side, but give the government some place that they can plug into reliably over and over again, in a way that they can put into their formal processes, and yet still allow for that informal collaboration to happen and allow for whoever kind of shows up at the, at the party that's interested, can do so. And I think it's going to require flexibility on both sides. The government to realize that a lot of the private sector players are never going to play by their rules, but also the private sector realizing that the rules exist for the government for a good reason, and that some accommodation needs to be made for them. And so I think it's really doing that education of both sides and building that trust over time and establishing those places as kind of that's the known clubhouse, if you will, where you can go to actually do that kind of operational collaboration. And it's going to take time to build that, but I think that's what we need to do.
All right. Thank you, Michael. I think we're probably at the point at which I want to thank everybody, the three of you, for participating both in the panel, but also all the work that you did as part of the task force, but the work you do every day. And thank RSA in the audience. Hopefully, we brought forward a concept, operational collaboration, but also the notion that we're not yet ready. I'd ask you, if you have the opportunity, to read the report. I think a group worked mightily over a year to lay out some really important thinking and some practical recommendations on next steps. So to the extent to which we're all part of a community and need to work together in bonds of trust across the government and the private sector, I just ask everybody to go forward and do that work. So thank you very much, and everybody be well.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
Thanks.